Have you ever noticed how people often bring up political events from decades or even centuries ago to defend their modern-day beliefs? It usually sounds something like this. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, so obviously he'd support today's Republican Party. Or the reverse. No, the parties switched in the mid-20th century. Lincoln would align with Democrats by today's standards. It's a common debate, and honestly, both sides of the political spectrum fall into this trap. The truth is, many people look to the past not to understand it, but to validate their current political beliefs. That's confirmation bias at work. And let's be real. Most of us have been guilty of it at some point. But here's the thing. Trying to shoehorn 19th century political figures into modern-day ideologies doesn't really hold up. The reason? The Democratic and Republican parties we know today barely resemble what they were 150 years ago. That's why in today's video, we're taking a fresh look at the history of American two-party politics through the lens of what's known as the seven-party systems theory. This framework is widely respected among historians as a helpful way to break down the major shifts in U.S. politics. In fact, if you check out the Wikipedia page for political parties in the United States, you'll find a full breakdown there. Strangely, though, there isn't much content on YouTube that clearly explains the idea, and that's what this video aims to fix. The only notable video I could find, it was an episode from Crash Course, U.S. History. It came out nearly a decade ago, and a lot has changed since then. In fact, by most academic standards, we've entered an entirely new party system since that video aired. So, what exactly is a political party system? Each of the seven party systems marks a period when something fundamental shifted in how America's two major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, developed their platforms, appealed to voters, and approached policy. These weren't minor changes either. We're talking about sweeping realignments, often triggered by major events, cultural shifts, or landmark elections. Each system didn't just represent a different version of the same two parties, it reflected a redefinition of what those parties stood for. In most cases, a new political era begins when one party makes a bold shift, and the opposing party soon responds, adjusting its stance to counter it. One of the clearest and most dramatic examples of this happened during the third-party system. This was when the Republican Party emerged, built around a strong anti-slavery platform. In contrast, many within the mainstream Democratic Party resisted those ideas so strongly, in fact, that several Southern Democrats supported secession, leading to the formation of the Confederate States of America. That political divide, as we know, played a pivotal role in igniting the American Civil War. Now, most historians agree that the history of American party politics can be broken down into 7 distinct systems, each reflecting a major shift in ideology, leadership, or voter alignment. That said, there are alternative models out there. Some scholars argue for more than 7 phases, while others suggest fewer. But for the sake of clarity, and to keep things grounded, we'll stick with the widely accepted 7-party systems model in today's video. So with that, let's travel back to the very beginning. The first party system, 1792-1824, the first party system kicked off in 1792 and was defined by a fierce political rivalry between two foundational groups, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who were, for a brief period, also referred to as anti-federalists. To help make these eras easier to follow, I'm going to give each major party a kind of main character. Of course, it's important to remember that a political party's ideas can't be boiled down to just one person, especially when we're talking about time spans of 30 years or more. Still, these figures offer a helpful snapshot of the party's core values during their time. Well, except for maybe the 7th party system. That one's a little different, but we'll get to that later. To help us really understand what these early political parties stood for, I'll be highlighting a main character for each side. These aren't just random picks. They're historical figures who best embodied their party's values at the time. It's not a perfect system, but it helps bring the story to life. Let's start with the Federalists. As their name suggests, they were firm believers in a strong central government, something they saw as essential for a stable and unified nation. The obvious face of this party, Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't just a founding father, he was a driving force behind many of the Federalists' core ideals. Hamilton was passionate about building a strong financial backbone for the new republic. His creation of the First National Bank became one of the most defining and controversial issues of the era. The Federalists also favored close diplomatic and trade ties with Great Britain, seeing them as a valuable partner. Meanwhile, they were far more cautious about getting entangled in France's Revolution and the chaos that followed, including the Napoleonic Wars. On the other side were the Democratic Republicans. And here's something you'll notice as a pattern throughout this video. Most of the time, whatever policies one party supports, the other tends to oppose, almost by default. So, the Democratic Republicans championed a more limited federal government, giving greater power to individual states. They opposed Hamilton's national bank, wary of concentrated financial power. Early on, they were supportive of the French Revolution, embracing its ideals of liberty, though that enthusiasm declined once it spiraled into violence and global conflict under Napoleon. They were also generally more accepting of slavery, though during this first party system, slavery wasn't yet the flashpoint issue it would become later in American politics. The clear leader of this camp? Thomas Jefferson. During his 2 terms as president, Jefferson shaped the party's identity and direction. Even after leaving office, his political philosophy continued to guide Democratic-Republican ideals for years. But before we go any further, let me flag something important. When I mention these party platforms, they don't speak for every single member of the party. Not all Federalists agreed with every policy Hamilton pushed. Not all Democratic Republicans matched Jefferson's views exactly. These are generalizations meant to help draw a clear picture. But politics, even then, was rarely black and white. It's important to remember that factions within political parties have existed since the very beginning of the United States. To bring it into a more modern context, think of how progressive Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders often clash with more moderate Democrats on key issues. Similar ideological disagreements existed within early political parties as well. So when I say something like Democratic Republicans were generally more accepting of slavery, that word, generally, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because while that may have been true in the South, many Northern Democratic Republicans opposed slavery. They still aligned with the party on other issues like state sovereignty and economic policy, but were staunchly against the institution of slavery itself. This is something that will come up again and again. No political party is monolithic. Parties are coalitions made up of diverse viewpoints, regional differences, and internal debates. They're not mindless groups where everyone agrees on everything. The end of the first party system and the era of good feelings. Now, returning to our timeline, the first party system began winding down in the years following the War of 1812. From around 1815 to 1824, the country entered a unique political phase known as the era of good feelings. This was a mellow period in American politics, mostly aligned with the presidency of James Monroe. Partisan conflict was at an all-time low, and his leadership helped usher in an era of broad public approval for the Democratic Republicans. Meanwhile, the Federalist Party, already weakened by its unpopular opposition to the war, collapsed entirely and faded from the political map. But of course, even political peace doesn't last forever. The second party system, 1824-1852, with the election of 1824, U.S. politics entered a new chapter, and this time it came with some serious drama. Andrew Jackson, a decorated war hero and populist figure, believed the 1824 election had been unfairly stolen from him by John Quincy Adams in what became known as the corrupt bargain. Enraged and determined, Jackson launched a new political movement, the Democratic Party. Under Jackson's leadership, the Democrats staged one of the most impressive comebacks in American political history, capturing the presidency in 1828 and winning again in both 1832 and 1836. As with every new party system, some issues carried over from the old one, like the debate over the national bank. Jackson's Democrats opposed it, arguing it concentrated too much power in too few hands. On the other side, the newly formed opposition, the Whig Party, supported the bank and saw it as a stabilizing force for the economy. But the second party system wasn't just a continuation. It introduced new issues that would dominate political discourse. Corruption and elitism in government became major concerns. Jackson campaigned as an outsider who rejected the elite political establishment. Once in office, he championed ideas like expanding democracy to the common man and attacked what he saw as entrenched power structures. His use of the spoils system, rewarding loyal supporters with government positions, also sparked national debate about fairness and integrity in politics. While most of today's focus has been on the Democrats, there's a reason for that. They were the dominant political force during the second party system, under Andrew Jackson, who, along with Martin Van Buren, co-founded the modern Democratic Party. Democrats promoted ideas that helped shape the era. Jackson was wildly popular and deeply polarizing, which makes him the natural pick as the party's main figurehead. Jacksonian Democrats pushed for limiting federal power, supported manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand westward, and justified the forced removal of Native Americans through policies like the Indian Removal Act. They also embraced the separation of church and state and portrayed themselves as champions of the common man. In many ways, this was America's first taste of populist politics. The fragile coalition of the Whigs. On the other side were the Whigs, a loosely organized coalition that struggled to find lasting political footing. While the Democrats had a clear platform and charismatic leadership under Jackson, the Whigs mostly defined themselves by what they opposed, namely Jackson himself. They were critical of his strong use of executive power and what they saw as mob rule dressed in Democratic clothing. Yet the Whigs never fully unified behind a strong, shared ideology. Despite this, they did manage to elect two presidents, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, both of whom died in office early in their terms, adding to the party's instability and poor public image. Fundamentally, the Whigs leaned elitist, conservative, and pro-business. They opposed westward expansion in cases like the Texas annexation, favored maintaining the national bank, and resisted expanding voting rights to all white men. A major contrast to the Democrats' populist push. My pick for their main character? Henry Clay. While he never became president, despite running 3 times, Clay was the party's driving force. As the ideological founder and heart of the Whig coalition, he worked tirelessly to hold the party together. In fact, many historians suggest that after Clay's death in 1852, the party simply couldn't survive the increasingly heated political climate, especially around the issue of slavery. That breakdown brings us to a major political realignment. The third-party system, 1852-1896. Around 1852, the old Whig coalition crumbled, and the U.S. entered its third-party system. The Democrats endured, but they weren't the same party Jackson had once led. By this point, their political identity had become increasingly intertwined with the defense of slavery. As always, remember what we said earlier, political parties contain multitudes. Not all Democrats supported slavery, but it had certainly become the dominant plank in the platform, especially in the South. An extreme example of this internal conflict came in 1860 and 1861, when several Southern Democrat-led states seceded from the Union, sparking the Civil War. However, not all Democrats went along with secession. In fact, Andrew Johnson, who served as vice president under Lincoln and later became president, was a lifelong Democrat who remained loyal to the Union. While slavery was the central issue of this era, it's worth noting that other important topics shaped the political landscape too. Enter the Republicans on the national stage. A new powerhouse emerged. The Republican Party, formed in the mid-1850s as an anti-slavery coalition. The Republicans supported strong federal government, the gold standard protective tariffs, the expansion of civil rights, and a continued commitment to Reconstruction in the post-Civil War. South in contrast, the Democrats fought to preserve states' rights, advocated for the continuation and later defense of Jim Crow laws, opposed Reconstruction efforts, sought the repeal of the gold standard, and pushed back against high tariffs, citing their negative effects on Southern agrarian economies. And while we often focus only on slavery during this period, other issues gained renewed attention, including immigration. This is when nativism, or the belief that native-born citizens deserved more rights and protections than immigrants, began to heavily influence American politics. Though immigration had always been part of the national conversation, it now rose to greater prominence, especially in northern cities seeing a surge in Irish, German, and other European immigrants. Quick recap: the third-party system, Democrats, pro-slavery, pro-states' rights; anti-Reconstruction Republicans, anti-slavery, pro-civil rights, pro-federal power key conflict; slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, new theme, immigration and rising nativist sentiment. As the third-party system drew to a close, America entered an era of paradox. On one hand, there was massive industrial growth, booming cities, technological innovation, and record-setting economic expansion. On the other, this same period saw deepening wage gaps, corruption, and labor unrest at levels the country had never experienced before. This was the Gilded Age, a time glittering with wealth on the surface, but riddled with inequity and political turmoil just beneath. These conditions would shape a whole new set of political concerns and lay the groundwork for what would become the fourth-party system. Main players of the third-party system, naming a symbolic figure for the Republicans during this period, is about as obvious as it gets: Abraham Lincoln. Yes, Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, just as the Civil War was ending. But his impact shaped the entire era. Every Republican president who followed saw themselves as an extension of Lincoln's legacy, championing unionism, federal power, and increasingly, pro-business policies. Choosing a main character for the Democrats, however, is more complicated. Some might suggest Stephen Douglas, who famously debated Lincoln and represented a more moderate Democratic viewpoint. But in terms of historical weight, it's hard to overlook the symbolic role of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America. Before leading the Confederacy, Davis served as a U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, embodying the states' rights and pro-slavery position that defined the Southern Democrats at the time. While he never led the Democratic Party in a formal sense, Davis represented what that faction of the party stood for during the Civil War, the defining conflict of this entire political era. Transitioning toward change, the collapse of Reconstruction, the shift away from civil rights efforts, and the rapid rise of corporate power signaled that political priorities were changing. By the 1890s, new tensions began emerging: growing public resentment toward monopolies and corporate trusts, rising support for labor unions, declining loyalty to political parties, with more voters identifying as independents, and increased attention to reforms targeting wealth inequality, worker protections, and democratic participation. The Republicans, long defenders of big business, began flirting with progressive ideas, a sign that the times were changing. The fourth-party system, 1896–1932. This next era officially began with the election of 1896, when Republican William McKinley defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan following a contentious and economically turbulent presidency under Democrat Grover Cleveland. With this shift came the dawn of the progressive era in American politics. While the Republican Party still leaned toward business-friendly policies, it began championing a wave of social reforms, support for women's suffrage campaigns, to curb child labor, expansion of workplace protections, the growing influence of labor unions, and efforts to crack down on monopolies and trusts. This was also the era when prohibition began entering the political mainstream, though it was less a strictly partisan issue and more influenced by religious and cultural movements. Another major point of friction was imperialism. America was expanding its footprint overseas, annexing Hawaii, the Philippines, and several other island territories. Foreign policy and expansionist ambitions went hand in hand, especially among Republicans who promoted these ventures as a sign of American strength and global leadership. By the early 20th century, the United States had firmly announced its arrival on the global stage. The country's involvement in World War I solidified this, marking the first time America played a central role in shaping international affairs. Quick recap: fourth-party system, Republicans, pro-business, evolving into progressivism, global presence expanding Democrats, still regionally strong, but often divided in reactive themes, monopolies versus reform, suffrage movements, labor, and the rise of imperialism foreign policy. America steps onto the world stage permanently as we wrap up the fourth-party system. It's worth highlighting two towering figures who came to define each side, not just for their time, but for the legacy they left behind. Let's start with the Democrats. My pick for the era's main character is Woodrow Wilson. His presidency redefined American foreign policy for the modern age. Wilsonianism became a lasting framework centered around democracy, collective security, and free trade as guiding principles for U.S. intervention abroad. And even if the term isn't widely discussed today, the ripple effects are undeniable. This philosophy would go on to shape U.S. actions in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other conflicts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. On the Republican side, one name stands out above all during this progressive era: Theodore Roosevelt. Widely considered the father of American progressivism, Roosevelt was a force of nature, aggressively pursuing trust-busting, promoting labor reforms, pushing for environmental conservation, and battling corporate corruption. In many ways, he helped to turn progressive ideals into concrete government policy. And it worked. Republicans dominated the fourth-party system, just as they had the one before. Much of the social and economic reform that took root during this period can be traced back to Roosevelt's influence. But times were changing, and fast, the Republican grip on power began to loosen as the nation slipped into the Great Depression, the worst financial crisis in American history. That's when a new political force and a new party era emerged. The fifth party system begins. 1932 and 1980. The fifth party system officially began in 1932, when Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, won the presidency in a landslide, completely reshaping American politics in the process. FDR's platform was centered around his ambitious plan to restore the U.S. economy and rebuild trust in the government. The New Deal. And the impact of this moment can't be overstated. This new party system is often referred to as the New Deal coalition because it was built on support or opposition to those policies. Social welfare programs, public works, and job creation expanded. Labor rights and union protections, government regulation of the economy, and eventually, greater federal involvement in civil rights through a mix of relief, recovery, and reform. FDR redefined the role of the federal government in people's lives, and, by extension, he transformed the Democratic Party itself. So, if you haven't already guessed, the main character for the Democrats in the fifth party system is, of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR didn't just lead a party, he rebranded it for a new age. Under his leadership, the Democrats built a big tent coalition of working-class Americans, minorities, urban liberals, and Southern conservatives, all united around the promise of economic recovery and national unity. But such massive change didn't come without resistance, major shifts, and Southern backlash. The Democratic Party saw more ideological realignment during this era than at any other point in its history. The party went from predominantly aligned with Southern segregationists and agrarian conservatism to championing labor rights, social programs, and eventually, civil rights. That transition didn't sit well with everyone. By the late 1940s, a segment of Southern Democrats, furious over what they saw as the party's betrayal of its traditional values, broke away to form a short-lived but politically potent group, the Dixiecrats, led by Senator Strom Thurmond. They ran a presidential campaign in 1948 aimed at preserving segregation and opposing federal civil rights legislation. The creation of the Dixiecrats signals just how intense and painful the Democratic transformation was for parts of the old base. Meanwhile, Republicans spent much of this period trying to reposition themselves in a country dominated by New Deal politics, often framing themselves as fiscal conservatives and Cold War hawks willing to push back against government overreach. Quick recap: the fifth party system, Democrats, recast by FDR's New Deal, pro-labor, pro-social safety net, increasingly supportive of civil rights Republicans, conservative on spending, strong on defense, gradually shifting strategy in response to Democratic dominance. Key themes: economic recovery, World War II, Cold War strategy, and civil rights realignment. Major turning point: the party bases began to flip, especially in the South. Though the Dixiecrat movement didn't last long as an official party, it symbolized a deeper and more permanent shift underway. Over time, many Southern Democrats who opposed civil rights reforms and supported small government ideals began drifting toward the Republican Party, which had started redefining itself around economic conservatism, tax reform, and federal restraint. by the end of the fifth party system, you can begin to trace the outlines of America's current political landscape. The two parties started to resemble what we now recognize: Democrats favoring government intervention, civil rights, and social programs; Republicans emphasizing limited government, free market policies, and conservative values. Of course, we're not saying the positions in the mid-20th century map exactly onto today's. You won't hear mainstream Republicans in 2025 advocating for the return of Jim Crow laws, and Democrats in 2025 aren't pushing for another moon race like they did in the 1960s. But the ideological divides that we're familiar with today, they started to harden during this period. Main characters of the fifth party system, as we established earlier, the Democratic main character for this era has to be Franklin D. Roosevelt. No debate there. The entire foundation of the fifth party system, the New Deal, the social safety net, and economic reform, was built in his image. For the Republicans, it's a trickier pick. You could make a case for Thomas Dewey, who ran against FDR twice and was a vocal critic of his economic policies, or Nelson Rockefeller, representing the more liberal wing of the Republican Party. But ultimately, I've chosen Richard Nixon as the Republican figure who best represented the party's transformation during this time. Before his presidency, Nixon served as vice president under Eisenhower, ran for president in 1960, and re-emerged to win in 1968 and again in 1972. He wasn't as far-right as Barry Goldwater, nor as progressive as Dewey or Rockefeller. He was a centrist conservative, ideologically speaking one, who embodied the Republican Party as it shifted strategies in the post-New Deal world. His political rise during the tail end of the fifth party system helped bridge two very different eras. When did the fifth party system end? Now, this is a subject of ongoing debate. Historians don't agree on a single date. Some point to moments as early as 1966, others push it all the way to the early 1990s, but the most commonly accepted turning point is 1980, the year Ronald Reagan was elected president. Why 1980? Because that election marked the collapse of the New Deal coalition. Reagan's landslide victory, combined with the Republican takeover of the Senate for the first time in decades, signaled a dramatic rejection of democratic ideals and a bold new conservative movement taking the political wheel. That's where the sixth party system begins. The sixth party system, 1980-2024. The sixth party system is the one most of us have lived through. And for many viewers, the political figures we're about to talk about aren't history books, they're household names. It all began with Ronald Reagan, whose election brought a sharp ideological shift that would dominate American politics for decades. At the core of Reagan's platform were trickle-down economics, massive tax cuts to regulation of industry, and a commitment to shrinking the federal government. Reagan's policies rebranded the Republican Party into a pro-business, libertarian-leaning, anti-welfare coalition, and shaped what it meant to be politically conservative in modern America. But Reagan wasn't just focused on domestic reforms. This was also a peak era of foreign intervention and Cold War posturing. Reagan's administration aggressively supported anti-communist regimes, particularly in Central America, sometimes covertly, as with the Contras in Nicaragua. This strategy, often referred to as part of the Reagan Doctrine, was designed to roll back Soviet influence wherever it appeared. And in many ways it worked. Just years later, the Berlin Wall fell, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, marking the symbolic end of the Cold War. Foreign policy, as a cornerstone U.S. foreign interventions, didn't end with Reagan. His successors, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, both leaned heavily into international affairs. Bush Sr. led a massive coalition during the Gulf War to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Bush Jr., in the wake of 9/11, launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, based on the belief in preemptive strikes and the war on terror. This heavy engagement abroad became a defining feature of Republican leadership throughout the Sixth Party system and a major point of Democratic critique. Quick recap: the Sixth Party system. Republicans, defined by Reagan's conservative revolution, limited government, tax cuts, anti-communism; heavy foreign intervention Democrats, rebuilding identity, supporting civil rights, expanding welfare; opposing foreign military overreach, global lens; Cold War supremacy, war on terror culture shift; the beginning of partisan media, identity politics and rising political polarization, while Democrats were strongly opposed to Ronald Reagan's strain of conservative economic policy, often referring to it as trickle-down economics. They were less divided when it came to foreign policy. In fact, throughout the sixth-party system, Democrats broadly supported U.S. intervention abroad, especially in the early 2000s. That includes initial backing for both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, a fact often overlooked in hindsight. Under Democratic administrations, U.S. involvement in Serbia, Bosnia, and Libya also demonstrated that military intervention remained a bipartisan tool during this period. Foreign policy, not just economics, remained one of the most defining issues of the era. Meanwhile, Democrats placed strong emphasis on domestic reforms, particularly in the realm of healthcare. President Barack Obama's passage of the Affordable Care Act, ACA, in 2010 marked one of the most significant pieces of legislation in modern American history, expanding healthcare access to millions of citizens. While opinions on the ACA remain deeply divided, its impact is undeniable. Other key Democratic priorities during this period included immigration reform, the legalization of marijuana, the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, including same-sex marriage, growing concerns over tech regulation and climate change policy. But for much of the six-party system, foreign affairs and defense remained shadow-dominant themes, shaping presidential campaigns, budgets, and national discourse. Main party figures of the sixth system on the Republican side. There is no doubt Ronald Reagan stands as the defining figure of this era. His policies not only shaped conservative ideology for generations, but his political legacy was revered and carried forward by both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, whose administrations largely followed Reagan's roadmap, especially on foreign intervention and tax policy. Choosing a face for the Democrats in this same era took more consideration. Yes, Bill Clinton brought the centrist third way to the party in the 1990s, and Hillary Clinton remained a most prominent political figure. But ultimately, the most culturally significant and transformative figure of the Democratic Party in this system is Barack Obama. While Obama may not have introduced a dramatically new ideological framework, his historic election as the nation's first black president, paired with his mastery of digital campaigning, marked a major evolution in national politics. His presidency reflected the Democratic Party's modern coalition, diverse, tech-savvy, and forward-looking. End of the sixth-party system. Here's where things get complicated. Much like with the fifth-party system, there's no scholarly consensus on exactly when, or even if, the six-party system ended. Some argue we're still in it. Others point to various moments in the 21st century, ranging from the aftermath of 9/11 to the Obama-Trump transition, as possible inflection points. But if you ask me, a compelling case can be made that something fundamentally changed in 2024. Before we get into that, let's explore the big question: the seventh party system, 2024 present. Many historians and political analysts debate whether a seventh party system has truly emerged, or whether it's too early to make that call. But from where I sit, yeah, it looks like a new system is here. And it starts with one defining figure, Donald Trump. Even within his own party, Trump represented a sharp break from the traditions of Reagan and Bush. He openly criticized George W. Bush, famously calling the Iraq War a mistake during the 2016 Republican primaries, a move that once seemed unthinkable for a GOP candidate. His America First platform, combined with a disdain for globalism, drastic shifts in immigration rhetoric, and a total refocusing on national identity and populism, clearly mark a new ideological direction. But when did it really begin? The obvious answer might be 2016, when Trump was first elected. But it's not that simple. His initial administration still included many old guard Republicans, figures like John Kelly, James Mattis, Reince Priebus, and others who came directly from the traditional GOP establishment. And after that, we got the Biden administration, which, for all intents and purposes, was viewed as an extension of Obama-era policies and personnel. That created an air of political pause and tension, not quite full transition. But 2024? That's a different story. By then, it was clear the Republican Party had fully transformed into the MAGA Party. Nearly every nationally elected Republican endorsed or was endorsed by Trump, candidates aligned with his brand. dominated primaries and leveraged loyalty to him as a litmus test for survival. Policies, once considered fringe, like mass deportations, trade protectionism, deep state takedowns, and questioning global alliances, moved to the center of the Republican platform. Whether you support these ideas or not, there's no denying the structural, ideological, and rhetorical transformation. Quick recap: a possible seventh party system? Republicans, from Reaganite to Trumpist, nationalist, populist, protectionist, anti-globalist Democrats, maintaining the Obama-Biden legacy, pro-diversity, socially liberal, moderately progressive key themes, deepening partisan tribalism, the rise of post-truth politics, decentralized media influence via social platforms, populism versus establishment tipping point, most likely 2024, the Republican consolidation under the MAGA banner. There's one more major moment to touch on, and it might just be the most recent turning point in modern political history. The 2024 presidential election saw Donald Trump return to the White House, this time with wins in both the popular vote and electoral college, ending a long-standing trend of presidents winning one but not the other. And to me, that confirmed something many had suspected for years. The Trump presidency wasn't a one-time phenomenon. It's a movement. It's here to stay. That's why I personally believe the seventh party system officially began in 2024. It's the moment when Trumpism solidified itself not just as a political style, but as the dominant ideology of the modern GOP. What defines this party system? To be completely honest, it's difficult to lock down major defining issues just yet. After all, depending on who you ask, this system has only existed for one election cycle, maybe two at the most. But a few patterns are already emerging. Immigration remains a cornerstone issue. Identity, politics, and culture wars are louder than ever. There's an ongoing effort to dismantle establishment politics and challenge institutional norms. Debates around transgender rights, environmental protections, and tech censorship dominate social discourse. And perhaps most significantly, the Republican shift from foreign interventionism to non-interventionism stands out. That last one, in particular, signals change. Reagan and the Bush-era Republicans saw America as the world's police force. Under Trump, and now MAGA-aligned politicians, the base has rejected that view. With calls to scale back U.S. support abroad, isolationism has re-entered American politics in a way we haven't seen in decades. Parties in flux, main characters of the era on the Republican side, it's no contest. Donald Trump is the main character of the seventh party system. Without question, love him or hate him, his presidency represents the biggest ideological upheaval in the two-party system since Franklin D. Roosevelt fundamentally reshaped the Democratic Party nearly a century ago. Where it goes next is unclear. But unless the next 4 years end in catastrophe, the likely Republican nominee in 2028 will almost certainly be someone who fully embraces Trump's platform, possibly J.D. Vance or another MAGA-aligned figure. On the Democratic side, things are still far less settled. If you count 2024 as the beginning of the seventh party system, we've yet to even have a Democratic president during this era. If you count from 2016, then we've really just had Joe Biden, a transitional figure who hasn't redefined the party the way Trump did for Republicans. Regardless of your politics, it's fair to say Biden doesn't seem likely to be the long-term ideological torchbearer for the future of the Democratic Party. So that begs the question, who will be the Democrat to define this era? Will it be Pete Buttigieg, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Andy Beshear, Gavin Newsom, or someone entirely off the radar? No one knows for sure, but what's clear is this: the Democratic Party is still in search of its defining voice for the seventh party system. Final thoughts and outro: the evolution of the two-party system. And there you have it, the 7 eras of American party politics, also known as the 7 party systems. Framing history through this lens isn't just a neat way to categorize things. It helps us see the big picture. It shows how change accumulates slowly in the short term, but drastically reshapes the political landscape when you zoom out. The fact is, the political parties of today are dramatically different than they were 200, 100, 50, or even 20 years ago. Hopefully, this gives you some perspective on something I mentioned at the very beginning of the video. You can't really map historical political figures directly onto modern ideologies. So arguing whether George Washington would be a Democrat or a Republican in today's world, well, maybe save yourself the keyboard battle. This video might only get a few hundred views, but if it helps even one person understand the complex evolution of our two-party system, and maybe shut down one more pointless online debate, then honestly, I'm happy. So what do you think? What direction do you see the Democrats and Republicans heading in the next 10, 20, or 50 years? Who's going to be the next ideological leader of the Democratic Party? What does political realignment look like in an age of social media, identity, and mass disinformation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. This is Endless Grit History, signing off.